Hello again, everyone. Here's another episode of Wonkified for you to enjoy. I'm your willing host, Rob Sullivan, and again, we're joined by Paul Carby as we walk through this nerd culture and Christianity theme and series. We have just finished polishing off a deep dive into time travel and utilizing the time travel trope as an approach to understand the nature of God and the nature of God's relationship with time. And even though it is like anything else, his creation, it how that create how in some ways it's a man-made construct, or he allows man to have it just so we can understand things without our head blowing up,
Yeah.
and how that just changes the how when we think about God's relationship, how that just changes our perspective of time in general, right? Is that a good way to put it, Paul? Am I kind of rambling or
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
yeah.
How we can make sense of things that seem to change while yet God appears to be unchanging. Yeah.
Yeah. So now we're going to start branching off into, I guess, the multiverse of time and time travel and the nature of time. And we talked about not only the two biblical ways of looking at time, or the two ways that uh, scriptural experts or theologians would look at time travel, but also how the nerd culture informs us of that, how culture informs us of that, and how time travel, the concept, informs us of that. And so we looked at, for the most part, what I would consider to be the mainstream, straightforward approaches to time travel, right, Paul? Someone
Yes.
develops a machine and is able to use that machine to travel through time, whether that machine be an old police box that looks like a phone booth, or a,
Or a
or a, or a
DeLorean.
or a car that led to bankruptcy and imprisonment for cocaine dealing and whatnot from the 80s, right? So those are that's the usual trope. Now one we didn't mention, and I failed to discuss, which would be a great one to talk about, is the what I guess I would call the natural time travel, um, which is not time travel as much as science devises a way for an individual or individuals to enter a state of sleep. And this is some of the more fascinating shows I think of, where they can be preserved and
Yeah.
uh, and can live in their current state for centuries if needed.
Like suspended animation.
Suspend, yeah. Their aging process is suspended for X amount of times, and there's some really famous examples of that, and some really, what I would call, very exquisite approaches to that. And there's some shows that we're going to talk about. One example is an episode of the show we're about to discuss, the Twilight Zone, where people are able to just go in suspended animation with the use of, like, chloroform. It's very yeah, very much a fictional approach to it. But that's one we didn't talk about, and I always thought that was interesting. And probably the one that really comes to mind would be, for me, would be the original Planet of the Apes,
Oh,
where um, Taylor, aka Charlton Heston, is traveling through space with three other astronauts, and they are suspended. And they set a time that's 1974 that they are that they, blast off, and they just go into space, and they are there, they think, for thousands of years. And so there's a big reveal in that movie that, we may talk about one day, but they think they're going to a distant planet, and they're all in at a distant time, but they're not really traveling in time as much as they're suspended in time. The author of that, it was actually a book written by, I'm going to butcher this, Pierre Brule, which sounds like a dessert. And I said that wrong, I'm sure. But he also wrote Bridge Over the River Kwai, which became a famous movie as well, and
Yeah, yeah.
has a nerd connection because Sir Alec Guinness was in that. But the adapted screenplay, and the name of that book was Monkey Planet, and it was very different from the original Planet of the Apes series, as you can imagine. Although there were intelligent monkeys and space travel and all of that, but the adapted screenplay for that movie, which came out, I believe, in 1969, was adapted by Rod Serling. And Rod Serling, famous for many things, uh, Night Gallery, which is more of a weird set. I mean, it was in the 70s, so it was just weird for being weird. And then he wrote some anthologies in the 50s, Requiem for a Heavyweight. He wrote several of those and very successful. He won Emmys for like three of those.
Yeah.
But obviously, Rod Serling is most famous for the Twilight Zone.
Absolutely.
Which ran from 1959 to 1963. He was the creator of that show, the show, what we would today call a showrunner, the primary writer. They, you may have the number in front of you, Paul, but there were 200 plus episodes dedicated to that. And if you watch Planet of the Apes and you're a big Twilight Zone fan like I am, if you sit and watch the marathon every New Year's Eve to New Year's Day, and even I think it may run to the second, there's you can see in some of those episodes some of the tropes that he used in Planet of the Apes. So when he repurposed that show, and the deep suspended sleep was an example, and that scene almost directly mimics an episode from the Twilight Zone that we'll discuss later. So let's kind of set up this show, and we're hoping perhaps to look at some scenes at some point, but the Twilight Zone ran from 1959 to 1963, almost immediately successful, maybe not radically successful, but definitely had a following. And Serling already had a following as a writer. So it was a highly successful venture, but like TV was in those days, some shows lasted forever. Speaking of time travel, like Bonanza and Gunsmoke, which started in the 50s and went to the 70s, but those were Westerns that had a very large audience and had a very, and back in the day, and we probably need to talk about just old TV and
Yeah.
not just the production side, not just the content side, but the business side, and how they had this different approach, and how for decades that rural world was dominant with the Western, especially in the 60s, with the Andy Griffith Show and the Mayberry shows and Petticoat Junction and all of the, and Hee Haw and all of these shows, and how at some point they started actually taking a more scientific approach to making money in TV, and they found that this was not really the best approach for advertising. So, but those shows would run forever. The Twilight Zone ran for, I think, 5 seasons.
Yeah.
And yes, it ran for 5 seasons. And the first 2 seasons went well. For the most part, it was again, episodic anthology with 30-minute episodes. After the second year, there was conversations about canceling it, and it wasn't like Serling was involved in those conversations, so they weren't trying to just get rid of the show and say, hey, this is not, thanks Rod, but it's not working. I think he was exhausted. And just so you know, he was born in 1925, died in 1975, heart attack, heart failure, and I'm sure that, and smoker, and just the stress of TV, and he often lamented and critiqued the business side of it and the control they had over the properties and the content. And so I think that probably was what led to his early demise. So at this point, he's already kind of exhausted from the show and probably dealing with the business side. And he says, okay, I'm okay with that, and we can just move on to something else. And it was canceled, I believe, in 1961. But the replacement, CBS was the network. The replacements were so awful that CBS said, let's bring it back. And they talked Sterling into doing it. And not only did they bring it back, maybe this is part of his negotiations, I don't know, but he got a full hour. And so there is basically a season of episodes that last an hour. And so here's the deal. I am a certified registered zonie, big fan of the show, but I'm not a huge fan of those 1 hour episodes. They're just not as strong.
Okay.
And to me, but I think most fans would agree with that. And a big part of it is the nature of the show. And let me kind of, just for those who are unfamiliar with the nature of the show, and it's the usually assumed nature of the show is kind of different from the actual nature of the show. But obviously and Paul, feel free to chime in because you've obviously seen several episodes, but I would say the theme of the show is people are put into a unique, I don't know if I would say magical situation, but the reason it's called the Twilight Zone is that they enter a world that no longer makes sense.
Yeah.
Or is a massive diversion from reality as they know it. And so they have
it almost has that multiverse kind of feel.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
That where 90% or 95% of the world is the same, except for one key component to what we think of as the physical reality is altered.
Yeah.
And I almost picture, this is kind of weird, but I almost picture Rod Serling as seeing all these snow globes in a room, and he just kind of picks one down and talks about what's in this snow globe and then puts it back. And that's each episode, how they're interconnected in that they have similar physical properties to the world, but yet one single thing changes for one person. It's almost always this locality of these one group of people.
Right. Yeah. And yes, and there's that one of the major themes, and I'm going to go through a list of 9 themes as I see them, and some major, some not so major, but there is this disillusionment, disorientation combined with isolation, because, and these are some of the scariest ones, or the most unnerving ones, because sometimes it's more of a shared experience, and sometimes those are even worse. But when someone is just someone, or maybe a limited group of people, 2 people, 3 people, they're experiencing a phenomena, and no one else is experiencing it. That sense of isolation just is what's unnerving. And I think it rides the wave of Cold War paranoia.
Yes.
To a certain extent, this sense that things are happening. And so there's these things that are happening in the world that we know they're there, but we can't prove it. And if we were just able, and this probably pipes into some conspiracy theories too, if I could just find a way to convince other people that this is happening, then they would believe me, but no one ever sees what's going on, right?
It rides that weird line of, am I crazy or am I not? Because nobody else can engage in what's going on. So there's that weird, which is why I think it's so perfect, called the Twilight Zone, where, we think of Twilight, things are hazy, things are not always clearly made out. And so you have this idea of, am I truly insane, or is this actually happening to me?
Right. Yeah. That's a very good. Yeah, it's a very good point. The Twilight, like you can't see beyond maybe what's immediately in front of you, and so it's not just, are you crazy? And that's a good way to put it. Am I crazy, or this is really happening? But also, how do I respond?
Yeah.
And so usually the episodes ran like this. And this is again the stereotypical famous Twilight Zone episode. You got the music, and then you hear a voice, and it's Serling's voice, and he's saying, submitted for your approval, or, this is, a young child, and in rural wherever, or who has control over the wheat fields and whatnot, which is one of the famous ones. And he just kind of talks about, this is a nice, bucolic, quiet town, but something's about to happen, and they're about to enter the Twilight Zone. And then sometimes it's just that voice, but then sometimes they cut and Serling's there, and sometimes those are some of the funny ones because you see Serling at a place where he's not supposed to be, and,
Right.
and he's actually got a cigarette at times too. So just so you know, that happened in this, even with family shows like the Andy Griffith, they would smoke from time to time. And so then you go cut to break, and then the show starts, and then you have 20 minutes of what is going on, 20 22 minutes, and then Serling usually ends with this narration and closing of this: here's the lesson, hence lies the lesson. Now, a few things about Serling, and then that kind of, and we've already kind of dovetailed into some of the themes like disillusioned and disoriented. I would also say it is heavily fictionalized material, right? And
Right.
but very much grounded in real human nature.
Yeah.
Like
I was going to say, I think what's really interesting about this, because, a lot of times it's compared to shows like The Outer Limits, these kind of also similar anthologies. But when I think of like The Outer Limits, I think of very science fiction
right.
based. When I think of The Twilight Zone, I think of it's science fiction to be sure, but it's more fantasy, supernatural, like you said, things grounded very much in reality. One simple thing shifts from this world to whatever the Twilight Zone is, as opposed to like things like The Outer Limits or things like that, these other anthologies that are very much, well, it's got a scientific answer, whether it's to aliens or something else like that.
Right.
And so I definitely, one thing I do find so compelling about these stories in the Twilight Zone is how grounded they are in human interaction as well as human nature. And they do so, I think, by keeping that kind of, to use, I guess, a technical term, the MacGuffin, the thing that drives the story forward, is almost always something either supernatural or fantastical, something that is more amorphous than, oh, it's just a scientific answer.
Right. And some listeners might not, or viewers might not know exactly what a MacGuffin is, but sometimes that's the like the theme of the show that may not be the actual theme of the show, right? But it keeps people moving forward.
Right. It keeps driving the story kind of forward. The thing that just keeps the protagonist moving along, so it doesn't just stagnate.
Right. So, but Serling clearly had a strong interest in human nature, group, and you see several episodes that are very strong in group dynamics. And there's, I don't know if you've seen these. We're not going to talk about them today in this episode, but there's the monsters on Maple. The monsters are due on Maple Street, which is, oh yeah. And then Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up? Both of those are very, but the monsters on Maple Street is definitely a classic example in groupthink and fear, and how, and it's also, it turns out, and this is kind of the twist, there's it's manipulation and group manipulation, and how it's probably easier to manipulate. And Reinhold Niebuhr talks about, the weakness of groups and how groups will sap your morals and your beliefs, and how individuals can live morally, but groups cannot. And how once you become part of a group and you're influenced by other people and their fear or their sense loss of identity, what have you, it can really shake your core beliefs. And it's just fascinating how that happens. So, disillusioned, disoriented, fiction grounded in very real human nature. And again, a lot of these are going to overlap, but that's okay. It's kind of the point. The third thing I'd say is there's a lot that's really based on Serling's life. Like any great writer, there's so much that's going on in his real existence that shapes and colors the series. He was born in 1925, and as I mentioned, died in 1975. And so that was 50 years, obviously, for the non-math majors out there. But there's a lot going on in those 50 years, right, Paul? I mean, he grew up in a little, small, sleepy part of New York. I want to say like the North Corridor called Binghamton Park,
Yes.
and very rural existence. Just that happy rural childhood existence. And like a lot of people of his generation, once he started saying, okay, I want to succeed in life and have, um, uh, and there's things that I really want to do that are really exciting. Um, all those things are in the city, right?
Right.
So we have in our generation, and for many generations, we've had more of a suburban to urban existence, or sometimes people just hop from suburbs to suburbs. And so their experience doesn't really change. But one of the themes I really note is this urban to rural existence that Serling and other people in his generation experienced, and that the stigmatizing nature of that transition and how disorienting that can be. I mean, even now, I live basically in the outskirts of Dallas, Texas, which is, I think, approaching the third largest metropolitan area in the country. But, so I should be used to all that. But then when I go to some place like, I love visiting New York and DC. Those are different cities, and it's an adjustment period. And
Absolutely.
I'm used to the urban life. So I can't imagine someone who grew up and frankly, seriously, grew up where at a time where not everyone had a car. Transportation was very, for anything from walking to horses to the modern era that he experienced during his adult life.
Yeah.
And it's important to note when he's 20, usually we, especially, and I'm kind of well trained for this, I guess, because my background's in urban, my PhD's in urban planning and public policy. So I've done a lot of studies on urban life, urban development. And 1945 is kind of the magic time when we start seeing that growth. We start seeing people moving to the urban enclaves because of the GI Bill and the FHA. And that's where we see the formation of the modern suburb. So that was Serling's existence and experience, that real, okay, I'm in this real country existence. And it's very simple, but it's also, and sociologists talk about this, you really know other people, right? Like you really know, they know you maybe too well. It's that small town. Well, Aunt Fanny said your Aunt Fanny
Yeah.
said you're out with
Absolutely.
Sally Sue, right? Or Peggy Sue. And so it's, that's one of the beauties of urban life. People don't know you as well as,
Right.
yeah. And so there's that sense of anonymity, which some people like, but there's also that sense of isolation, right?
Right. I grew up in small town Mississippi, and that was very much the case there. I mean, it was, it was definitely a suburb, but it was very much we call it the mom and M's. You're always asking how your mom and M's doing, and you know, everyone kind of knows everybody. And you do something on Friday, they know about it on Sunday morning at church. So it's, yeah, I resonate with that feeling, definitely, for sure.
What town was that? What were you outside Jackson or?
Yeah, it's a town called Madison, Mississippi. It's kind of like the Beverly Hills of Mississippi, if there is
Yeah,
such a thing.
yeah, I know. I know. I've been through Madison. Yeah, in fact, I may have spent a night in Madison once at a hotel, and it seemed, yeah, it seemed fairly nice. Yeah. So I grew up in Waco, which was kind of a weird. I mean, from the first time I moved to Waco, I wasn't there initially, but I was originally in a smaller town called Mahia, Texas. And so that was that small town existence. So Waco was kind of the big town to me, but it was only, 100, people. And so it had kind of the mixture. And then of course moved on. We living in Austin and Dallas is totally different deal. And Waco is equidistant to both of those major urban areas.
Right.
So it was right. We weren't that far from stuff. I mean, at least by Texas standards. So that's definitely a theme that we'll talk about, nostalgia with Sterling, and that's going to be our theme today.
Well, I wanted to go back to say something really quickly, if I
Yeah,
could, before
yeah,
we
go
move
ahead.
on, about what you were talking about with what Sterling had experienced in his life. I mean, 1925 to 19, you said 1925 to 1975. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. So, I mean, if we think about that time period, I mean, what did he see? Well, he saw the tragedies of war
Right.
leading into World War II,
And
right?
he fought in the war too. Yeah.
Okay, so he saw them firsthand. So
Right.
seeing the atrocities of war, then of course the boom coming out of it, the rise, like you said, of the suburbanization, the uh, the the GI Bill moving everybody
Right.
out into those the little pink houses that all look the same.
Yep.
Um, and then not only that, but also the rise then of the fear of nuclear nuclear power. What comes
Right.
out of this? And we've talked about this in a previous episode, or at least hinted at it. I know we'll talk about it later on, but those that early '60s movement, that mid '50s to mid early '60s is really where we see the birth of science fiction coming out of this, and it really, I think, relates directly back to nuclear power. How this almost godlike power that we have somehow harnessed, that we have no idea what it can do. I mean, we see Godzilla coming out of this idea of nuclear radiation from the bombs
Yeah.
that created this monster. We see Children of the Atom, the X-Men, coming out in 1962. We see, of course, radioactive spiders in Spider-Man also appearing in 1962. We see the rise of the secret agent in Dr. No first hitting the big screen in 1962. So, that late 50s, early 60s time period was so big for humanity, having all these questions of not only their own mortality, but the limits of their power. What could we do? What could we accomplish? You see the space race going on in that time. I mean, all these things that just push the envelope for what a free thinking, imaginative person could really dream. There was no real limitation. The answer was always, nuclear power. If you ever wanted to do something, well, something happened with radiation,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so this gave him so much background between the human condition dealing with the stark realities of war, the kind of almost blissfulness of forgetting when people came back from the war. We just want to forget and move on with life, the boom that came in the 50s. But then that undercurrent, that underlying threat looming on the edge of the periphery of, well, what is still there? There's this demon in the closet that we haven't truly dealt with, which is this nuclear power. And so I think that excuse me, gives such a great background to Serling, to give him fodder for so many of these stories that I think are so intensely relational.
Yeah.
It's almost, in a lot of ways, it's one man. And I know there are multiple writers and other
Yep.
people, but it seems like he surrounded himself with people that kind of had this same idea of what does humanity do in the face of this? How do
Yep.
we deal with this shadow side of reality that could bring everything to a crashing halt at any moment? And
Yeah.
what is possible?
Yeah, you're true. That's and that really overshadows any experience during World War II and the Cold War. The sense that it could end at any time, and our lives, our domestic lives, have never been better thanks to the support of the government and this growth and the dream city. Like Disneyland had this dream town, town of the future, where, like exactly like you said, it was the picket fence and the suburbs and the lawns and safety, two-car garage, all
Yep.
subsidized by the FHA. And that happens. And so and it begins really in 1945. That's kind of when we see the modern era. Also of note, and I can't, maybe I missed this when you were saying this, but the highways, we have the Highway Act, which connects cities. And I was driving. It's kind of interesting. I was this past weekend. I was making a trip on I-35, which is the heart of Texas, and all the way through, cuts all the way through it, and up to Minnesota. But that's the interstate, and just maybe a few miles away, we could see Highway 77, which was the old before the Interstate Act of 1956. That's how you got from, say, Waco to Waxahachie and Dallas or whatnot. But so that there are all these small towns that were maybe thriving or had a thriving downtown that were gone because of the highways and the interstate.
Yeah.
So you had that experience as well. And so that's where we start to see a country transition to this more rural agrarian life to the more urban, economic, industry driven, service driven economy and lifestyle. And Sterling's kind of in the middle. And just going back to his combat duty, he was Purple Heart. I want to say, I better be careful, but I know he won the Purple Heart, maybe not the Bronze Star, but he was a paratrooper. And he fought, yeah, he received a Bronze Star. Yeah.
No.
And he fought in the Philippines in Leyte Gulf. So that was some pretty nasty fighting. And while he was a paratrooper, I think at some point he actually had to engage in infantry level combat. So he was, yeah, his was a very intense war experience. You will see a lot of anti-war themes in the Twilight Zone. And a lot of people, I just want to make it clear, a lot of people will say, well, that's your typical Hollywood wimp and lefty, but those people need to realize that Rod Serling served his country in a very, harrowing way, So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, he was a boxer too.
Yes, he was. He was a boxer until he got knocked out. He was really well. He had what they might call the Napoleonic complex. He was only 5'4", and so he was always, that almost cost him, his enlistment. Because there just weren't many options for someone that tall, but he finally found a way in, and so that was the that kind of carried that probably his stature probably kind of shaped who he was and kind of responded to that. And that was part of why he was a boxer. You're right, he was a boxer in the service. So nostalgia, which we'll talk about, the urban to rural. Scary stuff, if you will, but some of the scary stuff in the Twilight Zone, I thought this was a great explanation that I read. We always think the scariest thing that can happen to someone in real life, but also in these shows, is that character dies. But some of the things, some of the fate that people experience in the Twilight Zone seem to be even worse than death.
Yes.
Like they're just stuck, like they would trade death for whatever they're going through. Right. And just being lost. And of course, sometimes we don't know what their fate is. And maybe Serling, and sometimes that's part of it. Serling just leaves it open. And it goes back to, like you said, that speaks to that human nature of wanting to know what's there. But in this Cold War, all these things are happening. And we don't know why they're there.
Right.
There's a very old, what I'd call old Hollywood, new Hollywood nexus, if you will. A bunch of the actors that you see in the Twilight Zone will be famous for the time. With this episode we're going to touch on today, Walking Distance, Gig Young was an Oscar winner, pretty well known at the time. You'll see some folks in Nothing in the Dark, for example, Gladys Cooper, whose career transcended and predated the talkies, if you will. She was a silent movie star. So you'll see some folks who had been in Hollywood for years and veterans towards the tail end. And there's a famous one in Elegy, the robot in Elegy. Some of the more famous and critical, pivotal characters were portrayed by those folks. And then you see some folks that are still today, not super active, but are famous, and they got their start as stock players in a bunch of TV series, one of which was The Twilight Zone as an anthology. What was great about that anthology is that structure of The Twilight Zone is that it was a new episode and a new story every week, and so you could bring in new actors. And so if you watch it long enough, and if you're of a certain age, you'll see people who were semi-famous for something else and people who are really, really famous for something else. And they got their start in the Twilight Zone, or that was part of their start. So it bears watching. I would also note that it seems clear to me, and maybe Paul, you might want to back this up. And I'm certainly not saying that Serling was a believer. He was, his background doesn't indicate that. I think at some point he became a Unitarian, but there's
Yeah,
to me a
I knew he
clear,
was Unitarian.
yeah, there's a clear belief that there is a higher being and there's a God. To me, it
Yeah,
seems like that all the characters and it doesn't, I mean, you might have some folks who start questioning the existence of God at once they're in the Twilight Zone, but never since that there was any deviation from that assumption. So,
yeah. I mean, he definitely has. I mean, speaking, just kind of pulling back and speaking on, I guess, a more philosophical standpoint, he seems to believe that there is an order to things, and
right.
these episodes step outside of that order, which is, I think, the nature of why they're so eerie. And whether incumbent in that order is a divine being, it seems like there is a set of rules that he assumes the world should follow, which is why these episodes are so unsettling, is because they step outside of
right.
that order, that presumed kind of structure. So yeah, I think so. And I was reading just a little bit about him while we were talking, and of course I saw that he joined the Unitarian Church at some point.
Right.
I think he did that so he could marry his wife Carol at the time. But I do know that one of his compadres in the war was Jewish, so he at least had some interactions with that. So I definitely think it's a fair assumption that he had a true belief in something higher. I definitely don't think he was atheist in any way.
No.
Seemingly maybe some type of agnostic, but
yeah, I don't think that he was, but Serling himself was Jewish too. So, and so I don't know to what if he was Orthodox but it seemed like he did have an Orthodox background, and so yeah, I think that's probably fair to say. That there was this belief in God and a higher being and a sense of order. And I would also note that the nature of the Twilight Zone also, while the Twilight Zone itself was a deviation from that order, I think it also would speak to some of the episodes, not all the episodes, but some of the episodes definitely have a otherworldly quality, and that's something that people need to realize. Not all the episodes were fully otherworldly or fantastical or
right,
fictiony, but the sense that there's something going on out there that we cannot explain also speaks to a higher being and a God, to me. That
yes,
and again it's a show, but it seemed like that kind of fit within his philosophy as well, that there's things going on that we just don't pay attention to. And not saying that he thought that the Twilight Zone was real, but that there are some things that we can't explain.
right. There's this perceived order, and then there's this shift that apparently,
Right.
somehow or other, these people find themselves in this cut between of some kind. This, the Twilight Zone, the presence that exists between the natural order and maybe the supernatural. It butts up on this supernatural or fantastical, which is why they are not so overtly over the top. They just kind of hint at that. They allude to that.
Well, and as Christians, we have a belief in eternity, and we have a belief about what things happen in that sense of order. But I'd also say that there's this sense of I guess there is not full agreement on how all that takes place and comes about. You know what I mean? Even though we know the eternal and the ultimate destination, what's the process for all that? I mean, that's still, not everyone has that down, if you understand what I'm saying. So there's still
Yes.
this sense of unknown, even as believers, right? And obviously we don't worry about that in general, but there's certain things that we can't say definitively how it goes about. One final thing, which is not as critical, but I just want to, I think we would both suggest that you listen to our episodes, either you, any order you want to go in, but definitely watch the episodes we talk about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But definitely watch these episodes and we will identify where you can watch them. because they are fascinating. They are one thing I failed to mention, which I didn't list as my themes because it wasn't technically a theme of the Twilight Zone, but it's fun just to see because it is about normal people living abnormal experiences, and so you can kind of see what normal people, what their lives were like in 1960 or 1961. And so I think that's always, there's some fascination with that.
Yeah.
But yes, watch whether you want to listen to us first and then watch the episodes or do the opposite. That wouldn't be a bad way to do it. And then you can listen to us kind of deconstruct things.
Yeah.
Okay. One final thing to say though is when you watch the Twilight Zone, and this is where I get a little defensive of things, people will watch the Twilight Zone and there will be this critical thinking that maybe doesn't come along with them. You'll watch the Twilight Zone and there will be tropes that will be what have become fairly traditional and long leveraged tropes. And one of those that I'm thinking of that really comes to mind is some guy finds a way to freeze time and to freeze everyone. And there's going to be a famous Twilight episode we talk about where a guy has a stopwatch and he can just stop time basically and stop the whole world can just freeze.
Right.
So that's a pretty long worn one, time travel and suspension and what have you. And you'll watch some of these and you'll say, well, wait, I've already, I watched Back to the Future or I watched the Marvel or, I read a book and I've already, it just seems like this is redundant or repetitive to stuff I've already seen. And then I'll remind you that this show came out before any of that. And so if anyone's duplicating someone's effort, those shows that you've seen are repetitive and redundant and steal from the Twilight Zone. And so it's important to note that this is probably the first time that some of these tropes and themes and have occurred on recorded television. Now, a lot of those are already in writing, but this is kind of taking some of that writing. And that's another thing to remember too. A lot of the famous science fiction writing and writers or fictional writers, if you will, had a hand in what came out on the television, during those late 50s and early 60s in the Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
And so there's things that you think, okay, this should be, I've already seen this, but Twilight Zone did it first.
Well, in some ways, they're kind of writing the canon that becomes the current, I guess, colloquial worldview. They're creating the space that these things that we currently use operate in.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting you bring that up because I used to tell this to my students there at DBU. We do this in theology. We cannot take our an ancient context and put it on top of our 2021 or now 2022 context and expect them to match perfectly. The only thing that we can do is, in some ways, to use the time travel motif, send our current context back in time to theirs to try to match and understand their context. And so, yeah, most people may watch these things today and say, well, that's all old hat. That's been done before. Well, not at the time. It was completely revolutionary and cutting edge and groundbreaking to think about back then. And so we have to respect and appreciate what Serling and his cohorts are doing. They're creating a world with which our current context exists in.
Right. That is absolutely very well said. Very well said. So, and again, one of those themes this comes directly from Serling's life and directly from his pen is this sense, or typewriter, is this sense of nostalgia. But there's also a time travel trope in this first episode we want to talk about. Paul, do you want to take a few moments to discuss walking distance and kind of setting this up? We're actually going to look at 2 episodes for this next theme, and the theme of time travel, going back and trying to change time, what we might even refer to, or what Paul would note as the grandfather paradox. And the 2 episodes we're looking at are Walking Distance, which was written by Serling. It was the 5th episode ever of the Twilight Zone ever. And it's a very famous episode. And a lot of top 10 lists include Walking Distance. We're also going to look, and so we're going to spend a lot of time on walking distance, but there's also a partner episode called Kick the Can, which is very nostalgic. And they both have some fascinating stories. Uh, Serling did not write Kick the Can, though. That was George Clayton Johnson, who was known for writing several sentimental episodes. He wrote Nothing in the Dark, for example. And it's from the third season, which was a very strong season. It was a 30-minute episode, though, right? Kick the Can. So, yeah, those were fascinating. So, do you want to kind of set up a little bit in the moments
Yeah.
we have? We'll need to carry this over to the next episode, I'm sure, because we'll have a lot to talk about. But you want to kind of tell us about walking distance real quickly and what's going on in that episode?
Yeah, we can definitely kind of use this as like a teaser into the next one. But walking distance definitely is fascinating. It's kind of one of the first ones I watched in this revitalization of Twilight Zone in my own life, kind of coming back to it. And it's so fantastic. This idea of a guy, Martin Sloan, who is a big executive. Serling starts off with his monologue talking about how he's a either CEO or a vice president or something, big executive, and he just needed to get away. He needs to remove himself from this corporate life. Definitely playing with this idea of corporate disillusionment, this, losing himself in this, New York rat race. And so he gets back and he just happens to have like a flat tire, or I forgot what it is that happens to his car, some car trouble.
It was like he had a car issue. Yeah, flat tire.
Yeah, car issue. And so he sees a sign. And what's interesting to me is, and we can talk more about this next episode, what's interesting to me is he doesn't realize where he is until he sees the sign.
Right.
I know whenever I get close to my hometown in Jackson or Madison, I know exactly where I am. But what's interesting is he was so lost kind of in himself that he didn't even realize where he was until he saw the headline or the sign saying he was only like a mile away from his hometown. And so he makes the walk down, and he kind of runs into this town that seems very reminiscent of what he remembers it exactly to be. And he starts remembering all the different things that he had forgotten or hadn't thought of in a long time as they related to his childhood. And I don't know how much you want me to go into it right now. We want to kind of leave some for the next episode, but definitely some strange goings on as he uncovers and realizes kind of the twist that is reminiscent of course, Twilight Zone episodes and what is truly going on there. But definitely that feeling of, as we're entering into this idea, he's driven forward by this desire to reconnect, this desire to kind of pull himself back to this point where he felt safe, where he felt joyful. And now he feels empty and hollow because he's pretty much kind of sold his soul to the corporate machine. Whereas now, if he can walk back, if he can have this reconnection point, he'll feel complete, is kind of what seems to be driving him back. And so he wants to kind of have these points of contact along the way. And it's very fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And Serling makes it a point when he describes Martin. He mentions his age, says he's 36 years old. And it's kind of interesting, too, because Serling's gone back and forth on this episode. His daughter has said quite often this is one of his favorites. It's a very personal story. She said he would, after this Twilight Zone, he does some, he's a professor at Ithaca College, which is not far from where he grew up. And I think he's like a visiting professor, obviously because he's a famous TV writer. He would speak to like the writing classes. And she said he would go visit his hometown and drive by his house and just kind of reminisce about when he was a kid playing marbles and walk to the pond and the lake. There was a lake by there. And so he would just do what Martin did in this episode. And he did also mention that 36 and was kind of the age where, as men were approaching 40, that they kind of started that nostalgic vision. And so I was trying to think through that and go, okay, obviously the lifespan at the time was shorter. And so, 36 meant something different in 1959 than it does today, I think.
Absolutely. But I mean, I can still, I'll be 42 this year. So this was only like 5 years ago for me. I remember, once you hit that 35, 36 mark, you no longer can check that one box. You got to go to a whole nother box on your governmental forms,
Yep.
So you start feeling, okay, well, this is, graying starting, a little bit of thinning hair, joints get stiff. We're still young in the grand sense of things, but
Yep.
you're starting to feel it, and it becomes your own mortality starts becoming more realized. And so, I definitely, in a lot of ways, I see myself in Martin Sloan as I go back home to my hometown. I remember, gosh, how different things are.
Yeah.
The Madison, Mississippi I grew up in is definitely not the Madison that was when I was when I go visit my father and my brother who were back there. And I sense the differences, and you can't help though but pass by that tree or that park and remember, where you can't help but drive past your old high school and think, man, what was it like parking there as a senior, and pep rallies and things like that. And so that's why I think that this episode is such a great one to start with, because there's so much of our own personality, so much our own human condition tied to it. I feel like, and this is more of a blanket statement, but anyone who doesn't resonate with the idea of nostalgia, just you kind of got to question, are you alive? Is there life in there? Because the one thing that is true, and this is a great tie back to our previous episodes, the one thing that's true about humanity is we are marching forward. Whether it's an A theory of time or a B theory of time, however we respond to it, time and the passage of time is inevitable.
Yep.
And that is the one thing that truly is, death is real, and we march ourselves toward it every day. And so wanting to reconnect with the past, wanting just, if nothing else, to, even though we can't stop time, maybe just slow it down long enough for us to reconnect and have those touch points in our memories so that we don't lose them forever.
Yeah.
I think is so just a part of who we are as people.
Yeah. And this episode really hits the nail on that. And the one thing I failed to mention when I discussed the typical Twilight Zone episode is that there's always a twist. And sometimes there's less of a twist than others. And sometimes the twist is because you're watching the Twilight Zone, and I'm going to talk about this when we talk about a different episode, but just because you're watching the Twilight Zone, you're expecting a certain result, and you don't always get that result because you're always expecting something horrific to happen. But the show quite often doesn't have a horrific ending. And it's JJ, of all people, JJ Abrams, who loves this episode, said this is a beautiful episode, and it reminds him that everyone thought that the Twilight Zone was a scary show, but at its best, it's a beautiful show. And as a registered zonie, I would concur that this episode is an example of its beauty, and it's an example of a beautiful twist. And so on the flip side, we're going to pick up on this and pick up on a deeper dive into nostalgia in the next episode. So, take a moment and move and take a break and flex or whatever, or remember people and remember your times and hop onto the next episode, and we'll talk more about that. But on the next episode, deeper dive into walking distance and nostalgia. So thank you. And now go to the next episode.